Hello, my name is Peggy Maddox and I'm from Kids on the Land. Perhaps you've heard of Kids on the Land from a friend or family member who's been to one of our presentations. Well, fourth graders, we didn't get to meet you last year when you were in the third grade because of the pandemic, and here it is. We're not going to get to meet you this year as fourth graders out on the Donnell Ranch. And we're really sorry about that. But since you can't come to us, we want to come to you. And perhaps last year when your school wasn't even in session in the spring, we put some outside activities up on our website. Maybe you were able to do those. So this year we decided, when we learned we weren't going to be with you again, that we would make some videos. But let's think for a minute about Kids on the Land. Kids on the Land has a mission, a job. We want you to learn about the place where you live. Why do we think that's important? If you know about the place where you live, especially the land in your environment, and you connected to it, then you will want to know more about it and to know about a place. It helps us love it and sustain it. We'll all take care of it. So fourth graders, let's think about what you know about this place. All of you know what state you live in. And I bet you can tell me what county. Baylor County. Yes. Baylor County, Texas. It's right there in the red square. It was named for Henry Widener Baylor. He was a surgeon in the Texas Rangers in the war with Mexico back in 1848, around 173 years ago. So you know the name of your county now. Let's think about something else about the place where you live. Do you know what ecoregion you live in? Now, eco is in a word in the Greek language that means home, and region is an area of land that is similar. Perhaps you have same wildlife or plants, maybe climate, even soils. Now, there are 11 different ecoregions in Texas. Your ecoregion is right up here, is Baylor County, and this whole area is the ecoregion you live in. Wonder what makes it different from the other 10. Think about your landscape. You don't live near forest, do you? You don't live down around the ocean where you have sandy beaches? No, you don't. You live out here on the plains, grasslands, you have farmlands. You're able to see in far distance. We have beautiful sunrises, beautiful sunsets. You live on the rolling plains. That is your ecoregion. Can you say that? I live on the rolling plains ecoregion. Okay, now that we know all of that, let's see if we can learn something else. Let's look at some history of this ecoregion. Now, I've made a timeline of events that have occurred over thousands and thousands of years here. Do you know what a timeline is? If I made a timeline of your life, I'd probably start with the year you were born, then I might add the year you started school, then maybe the year you started playing baseball. So it's a series of events in a sequence. Well, this timeline that I've created for you is events that happened millions of years ago up to today. So let's go have a look at some of the history of Baylor County. If we thought about a timeline for this place, we could begin 287 million years ago. In this area of the Earth's surface, there was once a narrow strip of land that was between two arms of this shallow ocean that covered the region. When the shallow sea rushed back to the Gulf of Mexico 287 million years ago, unbelievable animal skeletons of reptiles and amphibians were left captured in the Texas red beds of Baylor County. The little town of Seymour would become famous because of the little Permian fossil named Seymoria, found on West Coffee Creek. Seymoria had a combination of amphibian and reptile characters. This fossil is considered the missing link between amphibians and reptiles. The little fossil was named Seymoria in honor of your town. 65 million years ago, this fossil would have been living, and that would be 65 million years before dinosaurs. Now let's leave this Permian period of geologic history and jump to 12,000 years ago in our timeline of events in this ecoregion. 12,000 years ago, the first human footprints were on this land, and they were the Paleo Indians. If you had been 9 or 10 years old 12,000 years ago, you might have been living along the banks of the Brazos River. There was grass and water, trees and valleys, food for animals, and protection for man. The banks of the Brazos River were a good place to camp. 12,000 years ago, your people probably would have hunted the mammoths, like this one, and you would have butchered the mammoth with your stone tools. The footprints of the Native Americans appeared on this land 1,000 years ago. They were the descendants of the Paleo Indians. If you had been 9 or 10 years old 1,000 years ago, your family would have been part of small bands of Indians who hunted the buffalo on foot with spears and bows and arrows. Your family would have camped along the Brazos River, the river again providing water, shelter, and food. If you had been 9 or 10 years old 500 years ago, and you were a young Comanche Indian child, you might have looked in amazement at the Spanish explorer Coronado, who visited this area. You would have been excited to see a man riding a horse. You had never seen a horse. Your people would learn to ride horses and become the rulers of the plains. The buffalo herds provided all that the Indian tribes needed to survive on these plains. 220 years ago, if you were 9 or 10 years old, you might have made your home on the plains where the Comanche, Tonkawa, and Wichita Indians roamed the area. One of their favorite campgrounds was the area that is now Seymour. Wild game and water were plentiful along Seymour Creek. Around 165 years ago, if you had been a young Indian child, 9 or 10 years old, you would have experienced many changes coming to the plains. In 1858, the Republic of Texas set aside land which became Baylor County. Your county is named for Henry Widener Baylor, a surgeon in the Texas Rangers during the Mexican-American War. After Baylor County was created, the white men who came were looking for free rangelands to raise their cattle. Until this time, the area was home of Indians and wildlife. Around 160 years ago, if you had been a young Indian child, 9 or 10 years old, you would have watched as your tribe grew more hostile as they tried to defend their hunting ground. The fierce Indian raids drove the early settlers away from Baylor County. Forts were built, like Fort Griffin, Fort Phantom Hill, Fort Belknap, which is only 50 miles from here. These forts were places for the early settlers to go when the Indians were attacking. If you had been a young Indian child, 9 or 10 years old, a few years later, you and your family would have been living on one of the Texas Indian reservations. The food of the Plains Indians depended on the large buffalo herds that roamed the plains. And as the buffalo hunters killed all the buffalo, the Plains Indians were left with no choice but to go to the Indian reservations in order to survive. Your tribe might have been moved to the Brazos Indian Reservation near Fort Belknap. Does anyone recognize this man in this picture?
Before the Civil War, this famous general of the Civil War, Robert E. Lee, lived here on the plains and was in charge of the Indian reservations, and he tried to keep peace between the Indians and settlers. During the Civil War, the Indians left the reservations and were free to roam the plains. But years later, 140 years ago after the Civil War, if you were 9 or 10 years old as an Indian child, you and your Indian tribe were sent back to the reservations, but this time the Indians here on the plains went to Oklahoma Indian reservations. The buffalo were gone. 1876, then you saw great herds of cattle move through this area on the western cattle trails. Here in Baylor County, the trail crossed the Brazos River, passing half a mile east of Seymour, which became a major supply center for the cattle drives. 3 years later, in 1878, a group of settlers from Oregon came to this area. They stayed to form a town called Seymour. Then once again, more turbulent times came to the plains. The ranchers who wanted their cattle to roam freely, the farmers who were coming to the plains wanted to grow crops. The ranchers' cattle roamed freely and destroyed the farmers' crops. If you were 9 or 10 years old in the plains over 140 years ago, you would have heard of the Millet Brothers gang. It was said they were thieves and outlaws and would come to Seymour and shoot up the town. The Millet brothers had established a ranch 10 miles south of Seymour on Miller Creek. They wanted their large cow herds to graze the grass wherever the cows wanted to go. But about this time, a new invention came to the plains. The farmers began to put up barbed wire fences, and the Millet brothers cowboys made life hard for those early farmers who settled because they began cutting the barbed wire fences. 7 years later, in 1884, a law was passed that made it illegal to cut barbed wire fences. Law and order had come to Baylor County. So the Millet brothers sold their ranch, and with the range wars over, the town of Seymour began to grow. This was the same year, 1884, that the Baylor County Courthouse was built. Around 133 years later, in 1882, if you were 9 or 10 years old, you might have seen the paleontologist Charles Sternberg in town asking questions about the location of the Texas red beds of Baylor County. He would hire a team and wagon, and with the help of a farmer, he was able to locate what he described as the richest fossil beds in the Permian geological zone of Texas. Probably since then, more universities and museums have sent scientists into the Seymour vicinity than into any other geological area of its size in the world. In 1890, around 127 years ago, the railroad came through Baylor County. And if you were 9 or 10 years old, living in Seymour, maybe your family would have let you go down and see the first locomotive come to town. Then 2 years later, the first cowboy reunion was held in Seymour. It has been held every year since. And if you had been 9 or 10 years old in 1896, you would have seen bronc busting, roping, bronc riding, and even Indians from the Oklahoma reservations. Perhaps your father would have played on a baseball team. Baseball was very popular in Baylor County. 99 years ago in 1922, if you had been 9 or 10 years old, you would have heard that a great lake was going to be built, and Lake Kemp was built. Now we return to where we began. 7 years ago, in 2014, a museum opened, and today you are 9 or 10 years old and have probably been to that museum. 7 years ago, the Whiteside Museum of Natural History opened. And as you know, Clyde Whiteside, a local judge, was inspired to have Seymour have a museum of its own. He said the skeletons and fossils that were dug here for 150 years have always left the town and never come back. They went to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., or Harvard, or Princeton universities. So for this museum, Judge Whiteside said, "My idea is to have the skeletons stay here forever." No other town in Texas can proudly say, One of the best Permian bone beds in the world is right down the street. 280 million years ago, fabulous finback Dimetrodons called this area home. And now you call it home.
Kids on the land, kids on the land, kids and nature go hand in hand. Gather your friends, come along with me. Get to know your nature neighbors naturally. There's animals and insects and plants galore. There's fossils and history of what's happened before. This world is a spinning and it's only beginning. Will there always be room